Hello, I'm David Morris. I have been researching for a number of years now the situation in Myanmar, a very important country that sits between Southeast Asia and South Asia, and where there's been an appalling civil conflict in recent years, and also, of course, over its long and troubled history. And I think Myanmar is an important case for us to look at. It also has been in the news recently with a ceasefire in northern Myanmar brokered by China. So it raises questions about, can peace be achieved in Myanmar? And what is the role of China, a big, powerful country next door? It's an interesting case to watch, to understand how China as a rising power may act in the future. So in recent days, we've seen this announcement of a ceasefire amongst the armed insurgents in northern Myanmar and the military regime that rules Myanmar. And China has played an interesting role in brokering these peace talks. China has kept the channels of communication open with both sides in the conflict, which is a typical Chinese strategy. China has needed to keep those lines of communication open because Myanmar is strategically important for China. China, you would expect, would want peace and stability in Myanmar. Certainly in 2020, Xi Jinping visited, and Wang Yi visited as well, the foreign minister, after the election in which Aung San Suu Kyi was popularly re-elected. But of course, as we know, her moves to decrease the role of the military led to a military coup and the conflict of the last few years, which has led to great suffering amongst the people of Myanmar. So this tragic history is something that we really ought to understand, because it's a not insignificant country. Myanmar has a large population, around 60 million people, and for those of us passionate about peace and international cooperation and cross-cultural understanding, it's a very sobering case to look at. It looks like these conflicts in Myanmar are intractable. The dreadful pogroms that were held against the Rohingya people in the western Rakhine state a few years ago appeared to have widespread support amongst many of the people of Myanmar. And so this is deeply troubling, that there are these deep ethnic divisions in the country. It points to the fact that probably for a solution, there's going to need to be some kind of a federation, some kind of a structure will need to be negotiated that gives all of the different parties in Myanmar a voice. Now, that'll be the last thing the military regime wants, and sadly, in Myanmar's history, it has only been the military that's been able to hold together and govern effectively. Now, of course, it's effective governance. That word effective doesn't mean that I'm endorsing it. It simply means that it has the structures in place and the people in place to govern. But it's been a brutal regime for most of Myanmar's history. So many of us around the world look to Aung San Suu Kyi and look to that period of opening up and democratization of Myanmar. I think, including China, look to that period as a period of hope for Myanmar. And I've been watching very closely the language that China uses about Myanmar, because it's an interesting case of a big, powerful country with a small, weak, vulnerable country next door. And it appears to me that China's playing a game, quite a typical game for China, of wanting to engage with both sides and hoping for and working towards stability in this country. So it's an important case to follow. The lines of communication between the Chinese government and the military regime in Myanmar have been particularly important to China because China has big investments in Myanmar. Myanmar is a strategically important location for some Chinese investments, not least the big Jiapu port project in the troubled Rakhine state, which promises to link China, southwest China, Yunnan province, to the Bay of Bengal, and promises an alternative route to the Strait of Malacca. Now, all of this, to those students of geopolitics, people will know that China could have its trade affected if the Straits of Malacca were blockaded. And so China's been looking through its Belt and Road Initiative for alternative routes to be able to continue its trade with the world. So Myanmar offers this very strategic trade route for China. And so China's been investing in oil pipelines, in rail and road links, in a big special economic zone, power plants. And the conflict of recent years, since the military takeover, has seen Chinese investments being terrorized, attacked. We've seen deaths, we've seen lots of losses of property. So from China's perspective, they're looking for security and they're looking for stability in Myanmar, and therefore have been working behind the scenes to try and broker some peace. In particular, in the northern regions, there's been lots of trans-border crime and corruption, huge problems there in those northern regions of Myanmar, often with Chinese criminal involvement as well. And so this is deeply troubling for everybody who has concern about the country. The Chinese have been building a border wall and have been very disturbed, of course, by the conflict spilling over sometimes into China. So that explains why China's been actively engaged in brokering peace. Also recently, very interesting news in recent days that the opposition, the National Unity Government, which represents the people who were elected to govern Myanmar but who were overthrown, and also the armed insurgent groups that are opposing the military regime. There's a coalition of interests that have formed this National Unity Government in exile, if you like, an alternative to the military regime. And in recent days, that group has reached out to China, saying that they want to assure China that they want to work with China, the usual platitudes about recognising the One China policy, etc. And so both sides, therefore, in the Myanmar civil war are reaching out and are looking to have constructive relations with their big, powerful neighbour. So none of this is surprising. What's really interesting is to watch whether the big, powerful neighbour can help in stabilising and in helping to mediate some sort of solution. It will be a very interesting case to watch because it will tell us a lot about how China as a rising power acts in the world. Whether there's a need to further internationalise the efforts to produce peace in Myanmar is, I think, an open question. I think if these efforts fail, I hope that China and the parties in Myanmar would be open to bringing other parties in as well with goodwill who want to see a resolution to these problems in Myanmar, because these are deep, possibly intractable problems in Myanmar that we all ought to want to see solved. It's a really tough one, and it's not easy to have a positive prognosis, but we shouldn't ignore these intractable conflict zones. I think we need, as a world, to reflect upon the fact that we have enormous capacity and enormous experience in the world in resolving conflicts and in putting in place the structures, the investment to help the development to come and to the stabilisation to come. We've seen it in other areas of the world. We need to see peace in Myanmar.